All right, hello and welcome to Redspin's first ever CMMC Connect. My name is Lauren and I'm delighted to be your host for today's event. Before we begin, I'd like to say thank you all for joining us today. We're so glad you're here. A few housekeeping notes. First, this is an AMA style presentation. The majority of our time today will be spent answering your questions. We're going to start with answering questions that were submitted during the registration process, but please load your questions into the Q&A box as we go, or let us know if you'd like us to take you off mute so you can answer or ask your questions live. Next, I know you're probably already wondering, and yes, a replay of this session and the slides will be shared via email with you within 48 hours. And last, at the end of this meeting, please take a few minutes to complete our follow-up survey. A prompt will show up on your screen after I end this webinar. Okay, now I'd like to introduce you to our team of Redspin experts who will be covering an overview of CMMC and answering your questions today. We have Thomas Graham, who is VP CISO, Tara Lemieux, aka the Queen of CMMC and CMMC Consultant, Jeremy Mayers, VP of Sales, who will be moderating questions, and Rob Teague, our Director of CMMC Services. You are in good hands. All of my team members here on the screen have an alphabet soup of professional certifications attached to their titles and names, and they have lived and breathed CMMC for many years now. Thanks for being here, team. Thanks for waiting. So before I hand it over to Jeremy, I want to cover what CMMC Connect is all about. This event is for you to connect and interact with each other. Please say hi in the chat or feel free to have some side conversations while we meet. Our goal here is to create an open environment welcoming CMMC discussions from any direction. And we want this to serve as a platform for you to regularly stay updated on CMMC developments and ask your unique questions. And overall, this event is designed to help you stay ahead in CMMC. With that, Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Lauren. Before we dive into the Q&A, which is really the intent of this event, there's quite a few topics that we have been getting asked quite a bit. So our team is going to touch on those briefly over the following slides and tee up the Q&A session. As Lauren mentioned, a copy of this slide deck and the recording are going to be provided for everybody within 48 hours following this. So we're not going to cover everything within each slide. You'll have those slides to review later, but just to kind of prime the pump, so to speak, for the Q&A session, we're going to touch on some of the key CMMC topics that are floating around right now today. So Lauren? Thomas, do you want to kind of talk through just what we saw in the proposed rule released in December and just a couple of highlights for us?
Sure. So the much anticipated proposed rule finally dropped right before Christmas. I think DoD did it kind of on purpose. That way they could be out of the office for a few days without having to listen to anybody. But some of the key things that were identified in the proposed rule was kind of how the department was going to treat those external service providers. Whether you're an MSP, MSSP, or even a CSP, they identified what their thought process is around that. The second thing that they kind of threw out there that folks have talked about but still aren't too clear on is, well, how are they going to go about implementing it? Is it going to be all at once? Is it going to be a phased approach? And the proposed rule actually identifies that it's going to be a phased approach, and it's going to be 4 phases. Definitely don't have time to talk in depth about all the 4 phases here, but those were a couple of the key things that folks had been asking about, in the past, whether or not it was going to be actually defined there.
Excellent. Lauren, you want to move us to the next slide? So Terry, you want to tackle the legislative changes that we're seeing going on with CMMC?
Right, for sure. I'm Tara Lemieux, and I know all of us have questions about these legislative changes, specifically within the rule themselves, the proposed rule. How does that impact our defense industrial base? What kinds of things will you have to be looking for, or what types of actions should you be considering now? So just keep in mind that the CMMC rule, although it was released on December 26th, we're still in a little bit of a public comment period. That doesn't allow extra time for people to kind of consider and get ready. The time for compliance really is now. And that said, remember that compliance really is dictated by DFARS and FAR, in this case, FAR 52, DFARS 252-204-21, excuse me. So the legislative component of the proposed rule, the primary focus of this legislation really is to ensure that all contractors and subcontractors comply with the information protection requirements for FCI and CUI. But it also establishes prime accountability for validation of the cybersecurity flowdown requirements to subcontractors, vendors, and service providers. And that's important too, because what that means is if you are a prime and you have the requirement to protect controlled unclassified information, for example, then you are responsible for ensuring that those flowdown requirements are not only communicated, but they're also met. The phased implementation, we'll talk about that a little bit more in a subsequent slide. I know Thomas has touched on it, 4 phases, at least at this point. We're already very busy conducting our JSVAs, or our joint surveillance assessments. For me, my personal recommendation is really to get engaged earlier rather than later. Jeremy, did you want to take the next slide?
Yep. Rob, you want to kind of tackle the estimated timeline here in our cool graphic?
Yeah, well, I thought I was just here to look pretty, but okay, I'll which I'm failing at, by the way. But yeah, no, I'll take this. So we've talked about the timeline already a couple times here, but the main thing is coming out in 4 phases. So the first one is from the date the rule goes live, out 6 months will be the folks that do the level 1 self-attestations. Then it starts building on it from there. It used to be under the 1.0 program. There was some organizations that were going to be selected. We were going to do assessments with them. We were going to provide feedback to improve the process. That's all kind of gone away with 2.0 CMMC. So now these phased approaches, it's going to really start at the level 1 and kind of build its way all the way up to level 3 over a couple-year period. I think it's 3 years actually. So with that in mind, the caveat here is that the DoD has placed in a comment that at any time, the prime contractor or the DoD themselves can say, hey, to get awarded this contract, we're going to do another assessment. So that is one of the biggest things that we've seen and kind of collectively talked about as, the Redspin team that we've noted in the rule right now. But the phased approach will cover 3 years. At some point in there, you're going to start seeing sometime around October 26, a lot of the contracts will have the CMMC verbiage in it.
Yeah, and just a quick follow-up on Rob's point. It's important to note, and we're going to touch on this more when we get to the Q&A session, but it is important to note for everybody that, on this event, that the prime contractors flowing down those CUI requirements and requiring CMMC certification of their subcontractors is not tied in any way, shape, or form to the phased implementation by the DoD. Prime contractors can require it well in advance of when the DoD's phased approach would, align. So everybody needs to kind of keep that in mind if you operate in a subcontractor capacity, or as a direct and a sub, for varying contracts. So the CMMC cycle, Thomas, you want to tackle this one?
Well, I think tackle's an appropriate word, generally speaking, if we're talking about this. So I know we're going to clarify some of our earlier comments as we go along, but essentially what we're trying to communicate here is understand it's not one and done. There's activities that you have to do. So you get your assessment, pass with 110, everybody pop some champagne, do whatever. Well, now you've got things you've got to do, because you have to get reassessed in 3 years. And over that course of time, you still have to update your score in SPRS annually. You still have to do your annual self-assessments. And then you also have to ensure you're getting ready for that next assessment, because if nothing changes, cool. You know, you can rehash what you did and everybody can go on about their merry way. But most organizations, there's going to be some kind of changes. So you've got to maintain and update all of the items that you attested to when you first went through your certification. So please keep that in mind. It's not just do it and then don't think about it. You have got to continue working on this over the course of that 3-year window.
If I can jump in real quick, Jeremy. So one of the things that we usually recommend to our Redspin clients is a dedicated individual or individuals within the organization to kind of manage this program for you over those 3 years. Typically, we recommend to our clients that they send those folks to the CCP course. And why? One, it gets them in the mind of the assessor, so they know what the assessors are looking for. But more importantly, they fully understand the actual program itself and can accurately manage that over the 3 years, which will posture you for greater success when it comes for the research.
That's a great point.
If I may also interject, just remember for your maintenance phase, while you're aggregating and maintaining all of this data, make sure that you understand that there are some security impacting changes that could potentially impact your scope and which might require a recertification. So be very mindful as you approach this, that the communication is very strong within your organization and that the information that you're sharing speaks directly to that.
And just one thing I'll throw out for everybody as we're touching on these slides briefly and kind of moving on, if anyone wants kind of a deeper dive into one of these topics, you know, feel free to throw a question in, and when we get to the Q&A section, we can dive a little bit deeper and you know, go in more depth. For the CMMC level 1 assessment focus, you know, Rob, I'm going to turn this one over to you because this is really your bailiwick.
Yeah. CMMC level 1 hasn't really changed from what the DoD was kind of portraying to us at the beginning of all this, 3-4 years ago. It's still a self-attestation level. It's mainly for those organizations that are dealing with federal controlled or federal contract information. So what is FCI? In the description from the DoD to us years ago, it was those organizations that make uniforms for the military, for example, or cooking utensils or whatever the case may be, something small like that. It does not involve weapon systems, aircraft, those kinds of things. So this is comprised of the 15 basic cybersecurity requirements. And when you add the other 2 in from NIST 800-171, you get a grand total of 17 CMMC requirements that the organizations have to self-attest to. Remember, there is not documentation required for this level. However, at some point, your organization may want to grow to where you can now start bidding on level 2. So if you're going to start with level 1, that's fantastic. Get those requirements knocked out and out of the way, and then build yourself up towards a level 2. It's going to bring in more business for the organization. The main thing with this is the self-attestations are annual. The only difference that they did from CMMC 1.0 to 2.0 is rather than have anybody submit the SPRS scores and attest to that, it now has to be somebody from the executive level of the organization that must submit those scores.
We move on to level 2, Lauren. Rob, you want to keep going? You're on a roll.
I'm on a roll. So level 2. Level 2 now brings in the rest of the 110 requirements. It's still bifurcated in level 2. Originally, the DoD mentioned, I think last year, the year prior, that they were going to do away with the bifurcation of level 2, and it was going to all be C3PAO certifications. However, they kind of retracted back on that based off the rule that was released. So there still is a portion of level 2 that can do self-attestations. Who that is, that's a great question. More than likely, you're going to have to contact the point of contact for your contracts to get clarification from them if you fall in that category. For everybody else in level 2, you're going to be required to have the C3PAO come in and validate your requirements. That comes in, it's typically a 3-week process. Some organizations are taking up to 4 weeks. It just depends. In this level, you're going to have to provide artifacts, all of your documentation that gets reviewed. If gaps are identified, there are certain gaps that can go in the POAM under CMMC, and certain gaps cannot go in the POAM. So any of those level 5 hitters, for example, FIPS 142 validated encryption, cannot go into a POAM. However, the Joint Surveillance Assessment Program that Tara mentioned earlier is still ongoing. And in that program, everything is POAMable. So for the FIPS, using that same scenario for FIPS, typically what the DIBCAC does is dock you 2 points and gives you 3 points because AES encryption is typically in place. If that's the case, you can POAM that item and then they just dock a few points. The POAM phase now goes, the organization has up to 180 days to remediate those gaps. Once they do, they contact the C3PAO. They do a delta assessment of those POAM items, check the new artifacts, check the new screen shares to make sure configurations are accurate. And then they submit that documentation back to the DIBCAC to get your score updated to a 110. Okay, at the end of the CMMC level 2 assessments under joint surveillance, you'll get a letter of attestation from the C3PAO. That is the letter that will flip to an automatic CMMC certificate when the rule goes live. CMMC level 2 is one of the most robust levels of the program. For organizations that find themselves in this category, if you are waiting for the rule to go live, you are behind the power curve. As Tara mentioned earlier, get moving on it now versus later, because it takes a long time to get yourself and documentation prepared for that kind of an assessment.
And this slide here, again, this is going to be provided to everybody, but this just outlines the defined assessment methodology for the CMMC level 2 certification assessment. So it's a 4-phased approach. Phase 1 is doc review, phase 2 interviews, phase 3 reporting, and then phase 4 is that important remediation phase that Tara and Rob have been touching on, where you'll be able to address your POAMs within that 180-day window. Please keep in mind, per what was published in December, there's a restricted list of allowable gaps that can be POAM'd under formal CMMC. Joint surveillance does not currently have that restriction. So, Lauren, we can move on to the next one. And Rob, I'll let you wrap up level 3 and have the trifecta.
Awesome, trifecta in underway. All right, so CMMC level 3. This was our first look at it as it came out in the rule. To kind of, break this down, it's going to involve some of the requirements out of NIST SP 800-172. I believe it was 20 of them with like 80 of objectives that were attached with that. The main thing about this level is it's showing maturity, right? And that it's very interesting because during CMMC 1.0, when it transitioned to 2.0, maturity was stripped out, but level 3 brings maturity back in. So at this level, you should have KPIs established that's bringing in all kinds of data points that should be reviewed on a continuous basis to improve your processes. The organizations that find themselves having to go for a level 3, first of all, it'll be spelled out in the contracts that you bid on. If you are unsure, you can contact the contracting POC and they should be able to tell you. This level is going to be a DIBCAC-led assessment, so the C3PAOs at this time are not involved. And a POAM is allowed for that 180 days, same as level 2.
Next slide. Okay, so are your vendors and subcontractors compliant? This is something that Tara touched on earlier. We're going to address this again in the Q&A session. The key thing to keep in mind here is flow down requirements are going to be the responsibilities of those prime contractors or directs to enforce, not just communicate. So we can jump to the next one. Continuous compliance. Tara, I'll let you take this one.
Sure. So continuous compliance, and again, I hate to keep beating on that poor horse, but this is a big effort. And a lot of companies, the majority of the effort that they spend is in getting their data ready for an external set of eyes to come in and understand and use for the purposes of deciding their certification. But there's more at stake here, right? There's the overall legislative compliance. And if you've not been watching the news, the Department of Justice, through their civil fraud initiative, has become very aggressive in looking at the SPRS scores and trying to determine whether or not there was some misrepresentation, whether that was inadvertent or it was intentional. And that can potentially lead to a False Claims Act violation. I know with one of the case studies that we looked at, they were settling for $9 million. So if the settlement was for $9 million, can you imagine what the original financial impact could have been had they not been able to reach that agreement? So continuous compliance is critically important. Not just to assure your certification, but to maintain the best cyber resilient infrastructure and to thwart, hopefully, a lot of these very sophisticated and evolving attacks. So just make sure that you get yourself in the right mindset, that you're approaching this as, really kind of a change of, behavior more than just a external certification effort. Also, make sure that you're not waiting for those periodic reassessments. By that, I mean, it's a 3-year cycle. You have your certification on the first year, you're maintaining through a self-assessment on the second year, and then you're getting ready for your recertification. Don't wait to address the larger problems at the end of year 2. Make sure that you are fully integrated in this process, you understand what's going on, and you understand the impacts of any changes that could potentially impact your certification results and your overall cyber protections within your organization. I'm a veteran. I'm very strong-minded. National security is my background. Our vigilance really is to protect our nation and to protect our warfighters. And when you see the volatility of the attacks that are taking place today, and specifically the sophistication of those attacks and the impact, we can't just look aside anymore. So just make sure that you kind of change your mindset with this. Next slide, please.
Okay, well, that kind of wraps up our slides. So I'm going to turn it back over to Lauren.
Thank you, Jeremy and team. So we will now move into our AMA Ask Me Anything session. We have about 30 minutes. So if you have any questions, please upload them into the Q&A now. And Jeremy, I'm going to pass it over to you actually for the first Q.
Okay, excellent. So we had a few questions that were submitted in advance. So I think we're going to tackle those first. I did see a question get dropped into the Q&A as well, and it's very, very near and dear to our heart as well. So we definitely want to talk about that and cover that. But initially, there were 2 questions that I think are very similar in nature. So Thomas, do you want to tackle the questions of, will ESPs be expected to be certified before the OSAs? And kind of in tandem with that, what are the CMMC relevancies to MSPs? Are they required to comply if they support CMMC certified clients? Does quote unquote, we only store deal with encrypted client info, end quote, matter?
Sure. So give me the easy ones, Jeremy. So if you look through the proposed rule, there is a term in there called external service providers that I touched on earlier, ESPs. The way that the department is classifying an ESP is a cloud service provider, a CSP, and then everything else that's external to your organization that supports you. For those CSPs, and when I say a CSP, generally the way I think it in my mind is this is an external provider that for the most part stores CUI, but do they store, process, transmit CUI? If the answer is yes, then they fall kind of in that CSP category. Think Box, Dropbox, Amazon Web Services, Microsoft GCC High, Prevail, Kiteworks, all those types of folks. Generally, those service offerings are considered CSPs. Now, let's say you're a managed service provider, a managed security service provider. Do you have to go through this as well? Well, within the proposed rule, with the terminology, that's what's being lumped into that external service provider category. Caveat here is we're talking about the proposed rule, meaning it's not final. If nothing changes from the proposed rule to the final, generally speaking, any MSPs that support that organization seeking certification will have to essentially go through CMMC at the same level. I mention that because everybody wants to talk about level 2. That's the one everybody's concerned on. Rob touched on level 3 earlier, and there's a caveat in there that if you're using these third parties to support you under level 3, you're going to also have to be level 3 certified yourself as an external service provider. The crux of this, and I think this is what's getting to some of the questions that we've been asked, Jeremy. What is the definition of MSP or MSSP that the department is going to follow? So for instance, if you're just managing their current resources, are you going to have to go through it? Or are the items being managed on, let's say, your platform? And I'm thinking SEAM here. The question is good. It's a good question. That is definitely one of the questions that was, I believe we proposed to the department during the comment period, is clarification on what exactly they mean by an MSP, because those could be two totally different things. And that's something that honestly, even ourselves, as well as anybody else that functions in that arena, needs to pay attention to. What I would advise, if you are one of these MSPs or one of these external service providers, and you think you may have to go through this, start going through 800-171, the level 2 assessment guide, and seeing if at minimum, what do I have in place now that would satisfy these things? And that way, when you make the decision to either go forward or not, you'll know right away, here's the areas that we need to tackle.
Thank you for that. We have a question that was submitted that kind of ties to this as well, that was submitted by Emery, that at the tail end of it, it asks, also, could an MSP avoid the certification requirements if they don't have access to unencrypted client information, or I'm assuming unencrypted CUI data is really the intent there. I'm not sure if that impacts, and as you said, some of these things are still, we're looking for clarification, but do you think that changes the situation if you don't, as an MSP, don't have access to unencrypted data?
And if I can jump in with Thomas on this one, because the question, that goes back, that Thomas and I and Tara, we talk about this internally quite a bit. Is log data considered CUI data that is being captured from an organization that's typically stored with an MSP or an MSSP. You know, there's no clarity on that, right? So I always go back when talking with folks about this to what Thomas has kind of pounded into my head, which is if it processes, stores, transmits, or does anything with CUI, it's going to apply to you. Now, the question is, you may have, based off what Emery has asked, you may have one client that doesn't, you're not receiving any of their CUI data, so to speak, or whatever the case may be. In that case, you may not be required to get the CMMC certification. However, again, I go back to business opportunities. And if you plan on growing that business and gaining more of these DIB contractors into your environment so that you can, they become your clients, that becomes a business decision. Do we go after a CMMC certificate? That way we can now take care of the level 2 folks. I will tell you, please consider that greatly, because a lot of organizations are turning to MSPs and MSSPs because they just can't manage it internal. They can't afford the expertise to manage it. They can't afford the maintenance fees to keep up with it. So they're turning to the external service providers. So keep that in mind.
Another previously submitted question kind of touches on ITAR data, and will ITAR data be considered CUI data going forward? I think we already know that ITAR is CUI. It's the square and rectangle. But Tara, do you want to kind of touch on some of those higher sensitivity acronyms and how they relate?
Sure. Let's take one step back if we could, please. One of the things that I always reinforce in my classes and in our discussions with our team is that details matter, and definitions are where those details reside. So make sure that when you're talking about using all of these terms, you're utilizing the terms that the US government has officially declared as being that entity or that function or that thing. So in this case, when we're talking about controlled unclassified information, remember, CUI is information that requires safeguarding or dissemination controls that are pursuant to and consistent with some law or regulation, but it's not classified under Executive Order 13526 or the Atomic Energy Act as amended. So when I think the easy, the knee-jerk response for most of us is, let's go to NARA and see what the CUI list says. And that could actually create more problems than you started with, right? Because there's a lot of stuff on that CUI list. And it really pertains to, as Rob pointed out, how that data is being interacted with. So I learned very pragmatically, follow the data. When we're talking about scoping and we're asking the question of whether something is in or it's excluded from our assessment, we have to understand how that data flows through our organization. How is it being used? What devices is it touching? What processes or sub-processes are interacting with that? And are we utilizing that in a manner that is consistent with that legislative purpose and that business need? That said, as Jeremy so quickly pointed out, ITAR is part of CUI. There's two types of CUI. There's basic CUI, and then there's specialized CUI, right? Or CUI specialized. I think I got that right. So that said, just because something is a little bit different and requires additional handling and protection doesn't exclude it automatically from your CMMC assessment scope. It just means that with respect to that set of data and everything that data touches or interacts with, you have to examine what those additional handling requirements are and make sure that your governance and your plans and your procedures speak to that data protection. Because remember, your job, the DoD is entrusting you to protect our nation's data. And you have to be smart on what those data protections are, and you have to implement those. The DoD may not tell you how to implement them. They'll give you some examples of what they're looking for, but ultimately you're responsible for protecting that data. So with respect to ITAR, you should be familiar with those definitions, understand what those additional handling controls are. And so things like, no foreign access, no foreign nationals can access that kind of data. That's the stuff that you need to start considering now. I would highly recommend, if you haven't already done it, make an effort of producing a data flow diagram. It marks out every piece of information that is received by your organization, how it's being used, who owns that information or who's responsible for that information. And then if there's any specific additional handling instructions that here's how we're implementing that. Ideally, all of that's going to be indicated within your SSP at some point. But that said, at a very high level, very minimally, you should be addressing those additional handling controls.
If I can also jump in and take everybody on a Scooby-Doo flashback. If you remember 2 years ago when we started this, there was a lot of conversation circling about what is considered CUI data, right? A lot of folks were coming out saying that policies, procedures, the SSP, and all these other documents were considered CUI data. Therefore, they needed to be protected in a secure enclave. Well, I thought we defunct that years ago, but we continue to deal with this when we're at conferences and meeting folks in public here. How can you, and I just pose this question just as a common sense thought process. I know common sense is a superpower, but hang in there with me. So common sense states, if your users have to read the policies and procedures before they can gain access to that environment, how are they going to read those policies and procedures that are in the environment that they need access to, that they can't have access to if they don't read the policies and procedures prior to gaining access to that document? Right? So keep that in mind. CUI data is going to continue to develop and get better as the years go on. Remember, folks, we're at the beginning of this program. There's going to be a lot of tweaks and efforts. CMMC 1.0 was designed to get rid of a lot of those issues in the early stages. That way, when it went live for everybody else, most of these bugs were removed. We're now going to be building the airplane in flight. So just be flexible with it and use common sense. If it looks like CUI data to you, treat it as such, right?
I want to jump to a couple of questions that were submitted in the chat here, because there's a couple of good ones and a couple of them tie together. But just real quickly, if my company gets level 3 certified, and this was submitted by Lynn, if my company gets level 3 certified, does that impact the level requirement of our subs, vendors, CSPs, etc.? So and I think we kind of touched on this with the ESPs, where as the way it currently reads, an ESP will need CMMC certification equal to the level of their clients. But how does that impact subcontractors with flow downs?
Yeah, so I'll start it first, and then Tara and Thomas can jump in. So that's a great question, Lynn. We appreciate you submitting this because we do get asked this a lot. So it depends, right? And you're going to hear that a lot when we're answering a lot of these questions. It does depend. First of all, are the subs using and accessing the same data that the prime is doing? If that is the case, they will require that same level certification. If the flow down requirement is pushed to them via the prime that states you must access this data, this is what you're going to use, yes, they will have to be the same level of CMMC. However, there are some nuances. For example, if a prime uses a repository or an enclave that all these folks access to, and that doesn't spill out anywhere else, does that organization or the sub still need CMMC level 3? If they're accessing the data, yes. If they're not accessing the data or something that doesn't require a level 3, then no, they don't need it. See how that gets confusing? So hopefully Thomas and Tara can clean that up a little bit.
Yeah, so follow the data, right? We've done this a few times before. understanding, again, once again, how that data is going to be interacted with will likely get you about 80% to the answer of your question. Now, it may not always be the answer you want, right? Maybe you have a good relationship with a supplier or a subcontractor, and you would like to, at some point, be certified at CMMC level 3, but you're not sure that you can bring them along the journey with you. To which case I would, pose back to you, maybe it's time to re-examine that business relationship. Don't let them go, but maybe the access that they have, because scoping is a really powerful tool. If you understand the rules, you can save a lot of effort, time, and money, and grief too. So for example, if I change how much data or the nature and context of the data that they're interacting with, I can potentially de-scope them from my certification boundary. So keep that in mind. I know we're kind of fire hosing everything to you right now, but it's just, it's a very powerful tool. If you haven't read the scoping guides yet, guys, get out there and start reading those scoping guides. Even if you're starting with level 1 self-assessment, start reading up on CMMC level 2 scoping and how it's done and what's in and what's out, because honestly, I anticipate, given the, how aggressive the DOJ is being with these False Claims Act violations, some of these determinations are going to come down to whether or not you had the right boundary for your certification assessment. So it's very important for you to get that right.
So what Rob and Tara is referring to is the requirements under the contract. Okay. Keep in mind when we're talking proposed rule, and this is important for you to understand, there's 2 rules. There's 32 CFR rule, that was the proposed rule that dropped in December that everybody refers to. That is what helps establish and codify the program, essentially. Hey, CMMC assessments, here's what they are. The Department of Defense can't enforce them via the contract vehicle until 48 CFR is updated. That's your DFARS requirements. So what Rob and Tara is referring to is those contract requirements when you're bidding on contracts, when the department is looking at it, if you come under spot audit, stuff of that nature. But here's the other thing to remember, and I remember this because I used to be a contractor. None of this affects what the prime on the contract can require for anybody on their team. And the reason why that's important to remember is that for anybody that's bidding on contracts, all of you know that there's quals, there's other things in there to where you can get different points, you can try and stand out from your competitors. A lot of the larger primes that we're seeing have already started quietly talking to their subs or their team members and saying, you need to get in line when this goes live. You need to get the cert because everybody on our team is going to be this way. So please understand that there's those 2 avenues. There's the mandate, the contractual requirement, and then there's what your team requirement is, for a particular contract.
Excellent. Thank you, guys. Another pre-submitted question that I'm going to knock out real quickly here was someone who's familiar with 853 and the risk management framework and kind of asking, okay, how does that relate to 171? And essentially 171 maps to 853 because it's essentially just a slimmed down skinny version of 853. So if you previously worked with 53 and implemented controls based on 53, you are typically in a very strong position for CMMC and meeting 171's requirements. So another pre-submitted question I want to toss out just real quickly. I would like to know if there are any reciprocity plans the DoD has for CMMC with other certifications such as High Trust or SOC Type 2. As you know, have any of our panelists here, kind of heard anything of that sort? I'm not aware of anything, so I'm throwing that out to you guys.
No, that's been asked in several of the meetings I've been in with some of the Cyber AB and some of the other folks. Right now, there is not any talk of reciprocity with anything beyond what the requirement is for FedRAMP for CSPs. That was actually in the proposed rule. But if you're thinking ISO 27001, any of those types of things, no. Now, what I can tell you is that if you have those certifications, or if you're using, let's say, a SOC 2 type or a SOC 2 certified data center, that's absolutely something that you can provide as part of your objective evidence, because that gives assessors, when they're reviewing that, a baseline to work from. And it also helps show that you're doing your due diligence, not to just go down to Lowe's and buy a shed, stick it in your backyard, and spin up your own data center that way.
Okay. Another pre-submitted question, kind of the last of these here, is if an organization has already gone through a DIBCAC high audit and passed, how does that play into the proposed rule? And I believe it means that you still need to get CMMC certified. However, just in case, I'm going to toss that out to you guys, and in case there's anything different there.
Oh, this is a Rob question.
Yeah, so you know, according to the DoD, the CyberAB, and everybody else, a DIBCAC high on its own is not CMMC. So what makes it CMMC is an example, the Joint Surveillance Assessment Program. That's where DIBCAC, the DCMA DIBCAC, will come in and do their DIBCAC high jointly with the C3PAO, who is doing an NIST 800-171 assessment with a little bit of the CMMC methodology mixed in there. It's those organizations that it will automatically flip. Now, what we are being told by the DIBCAC teams is that when you get contacted by them for your DIBCAC high, you know, research or assessment or whatever the case may be, you can ask them about the Joint Surveillance Assessment, and they can flip you over and get you enrolled in that. That is the way to go, because you cannot get the CMMC certificate without the C3PAO. Everybody thinks it's the DoD that issues the CMMC certificates. That's not. It's the C3PAOs. Hope
Excellent.
that helped.
Yeah, no, that was great. Thank you, Rob. Okay, a couple more questions here that kind of tied to one another. Bill has a couple of questions regarding how does the use of PKIs fit into you know, the CMMC solution, and can contractors rely on the use of government issued common access cards, CACs? Didn't know if everybody understood the CAC acronym, so I had to think about it, but to kind of gain the PKI cert. So I will throw that out to the crowd and let you guys kind of jump in.
Well, in short, Jeremy, one way that PKI could be utilized is for MFA, authorized access, identification of users. There are several different areas that it could be utilized in, and it just depends. I mean, if you're talking about encryption of CUI in transit, well, if you encapsulate it with the encryption that's the certificate that's part of your PKI, it meets internal DoD requirements. So why wouldn't it meet CMMC requirements? I mean, that, you know, if you just want to talk layman's terms. If there's specific use cases, Bill, that you're thinking of that you kind of want to get a better feel for, please reach out to me. I know Lauren has posted our LinkedIn's in the chat. Email me, you know, whatever. If you have, you know, some of those individualized use cases or something outside of that you're thinking, that's where, you know, either myself or Rob, Tara, any of us can jump on the phone and kind of talk through that with you. It doesn't cost anything to have a conversation.
I would add to that, Thomas, also, if you're looking at it from a purely CMMC perspective, identification and authentication, that domain, there's you know, that, as well as access control, systems and communication protection. I think that's where you're going to get the benefit from, you know, the CAC cards and that sort of thing.
Another question that it's kind of a pair of questions here that kind of tie together well. Obviously, we touched on CSPs earlier, but outside of the CSPs in the broader software world, Emery has a follow-up question kind of regarding, do those software tools need to be FedRAMP moderate or higher? And has any kind of definition been provided on what is considered to be FedRAMP moderate equivalent? Thomas, I'll throw this one your way because I know that you've had quite a few conversations about the moderate equivalent piece.
So regarding equivalency, there is information in the proposed rule that identifies what you have to do to be FedRAMP equivalent. And honestly, I don't have enough time to go through all of it here. I can tell you the opinion of a lot of folks I've talked to is that it's actually a harder process than getting FedRAMP authorization. Specifically, you have to meet 100% of the FedRAMP mod requirements. Under FedRAMP authorization, you may not, and the reason being is because a DoD agency accepts the risks for the items that you put on your POIN. In the equivalency scenario, you don't have the agency basically vouching and saying, hey, we're going to accept the risk. So with that in mind, if it's software, well, does it fit one of those definitions? Is it a CSP? Is it an MSP? Is it an MSSP? If it's just software that you're installing, does it have to meet the requirements? Is it a security protection piece of software? Does it store, process, or transmit CUI? Answer is one of those, then maybe, probably. I'll give you an example. Microsoft Word technically is a piece of software. Microsoft Word isn't certified, but the configurations for it to include, back-end group policies, or whether you're using Azure AD or Intra stuff to configure it, that's where the protections are coming in. The software is just getting installed, but in and of itself isn't intended to meet one of those defined criteria. And I'm pretty sure I just thoroughly confused everybody.
I think you brought a good point to play. Getting back to those scoping documents, right? You'll notice that there are asset categories now that have been introduced. They were there under CMMC 1.0-ish, but now they've become more formalized. And so to that end, we have to kind of, educate ourselves on what constitutes a security protection asset versus a contractor managed asset, and so on. And again, coming back to scoping, I hate to, keep tooting my horn on this, but if you really want to conserve costs and effort and really, maximize, the benefit from this effort, including making your organization more cyber resilient, then really look at those scoping documents to understand really, can we make a smaller footprint? And if we make a smaller footprint, then that's less that we have to manage, that's less that we have to control. And it could be that those tools and those providers that we've been talking about throughout this conversation, that could kind of shake out some of the answers just through that process alone.
Yeah, I think we got time for one last question here. Nancy submitted a question about the DoD's projections of 78,000 organizations needing level 2 over a 7-year period, and kind of, how many of us in the field believe that that's an underestimation, and what Redspin's thoughts may be regarding demand and timelines. And I can kind of touch on this one because I talk about this one a lot with folks that we're working with. I think, as Nancy mentioned, I think we all agree that 78,000 is an underestimation of how many organizations are going to need certification. I think it's also key to keep in mind that This is beginning as a DoD program, but there are already quite a few other federal agencies that have stated openly in interviews that they plan to adopt CMMC for their own CUI protections within their contracts, which is going to significantly expand the number of organizations who will be seeking CMMC certifications. As far as timelines and demand go, this is obviously just, my opinion or the Redspin opinion. We have dozens of signed clients waiting to get into the joint surveillance program. We have a large queue of folks who, for varying reasons, are not eligible for the joint surveillance program and are awaiting the rule dropping. Just the publishing of the rule in December kicked off a massive surge of activity. When the rule goes live, we expect it to be a tidal wave. So as has been said a few times during this discussion, being proactive, being ahead of the curve, engage a C3PAO, whether it's our firm, another firm, get on someone's calendar, get in someone's queue, because the wait lists are going to be significant. There just aren't enough C3PAOs or not enough assessors within the ecosystem yet. This is all still early. It's growing, but I don't know if it's going to grow at a pace to keep up with that initial surge of activity when the rule goes live. And I hope that answers your question, Nancy.
And also remember, Nancy, the rule is also being pushed across all federal agencies. So
yeah,
we've already seen the Department of Education produce a document stating that anybody that deals with FAFSA or the federal loan requirements for universities, that's all considered CUI data. So that was never originally counted in the first set of numbers. Yeah. Keep that in mind. Last thing for you, Jeremy, somebody asked about CCA qualifications. I know we're out of time. Redspin is a licensed training provider. You're looking at our instructors, which is Tara and Thomas. One of the benefits of attending the CCP or the CCA course with Redspin is that we put you on our assessments. And yes, mock assessments and joint surveillance assessments count towards your 3 required certification assessments to become a CCA.
And with that, Lauren, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, that was awesome. And we are coming to an end. At Redspin, we're here to help and we're committed to your success. So if you have any additional questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. I'll share contact.
Kind of lost her.
Audio cut out there for a moment, but we have some upcoming events that we are going to be at. So in February, if anybody is going to be in San Diego and attending the FCO West event, several of actually everybody on here will be there. We're also going to be attending CUI Con later in February. Early March will be at CIC, CUICon being down in Florida, CIC being back in San Diego. But we're also going to host this event again with this AMA open forum again at the end of February, and this will become a monthly recurring event. So if we weren't able to address anyone with a question today, we'll definitely, tackle that next month as well. And, as Lauren and Rob and all of us have been saying, absolutely feel free to reach out to us, reach out to us through LinkedIn, through our website. You can submit questions to the redspin.com website. You will get the slide deck. That CMMC resources link will take you to our resource center on our website. There are, 2.5 years of blogs, white papers, podcast recordings, etc., covering a wide array of CMMC topics that are just out there free to the ecosystem to assist everybody in their preparation. So Lauren, are you back?
I'm back. Thank you so much, Jeremy. Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes, you're good to go.
Well, with that, we will go ahead and end today's webinar. Thank you again, folks. We'll see you in February. And please don't forget to fill out our survey that will prompt here shortly.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, team.